Good morning, everyone. This is Corey Tile at the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. I'm going to be starting the webinar off today and introducing our speakers. Very, very pleased that all of you could join us this morning for the webinar on a common approach to addressing quality of care issues and community caregiver investigations. You may remember that this is the fifth in a series of webinars addressing critical issues in residential services for children in care. The first webinar was on special rate agreements, new policies and procedures that govern those. The second on the implementation of the information policy related to OPRs and information sharing guidelines. The third on focused on children placed outside their home jurisdiction and the shared care agreements that we recommend be in place whenever more than one society is involved. The fourth on the First Nations Indigenous service model. And I'm hoping that many of you on the phone today were able to attend those webinars as well. But if not, they are all uploaded into the member site under a residential service portal. If you look at that portal, it includes all of these webinars and the associated documents that were circulated with respect to each one. I'd like to give you a bit of background to the webinar today. You'll remember in 2017, our sector, and probably many of you, were galvanized into understanding that with respect to the deaths of many young people in residential care, a majority of those deaths involving Indigenous children and youth, we realized that our sector was responsible for some issues that contributed to those tragedies. Of course, there are always multiple systems involved, and we can easily point fingers at the government and children's mental health and other local systems issues. But we realized together, unanimously, that our sector was responsible for some of the critical issues that we saw in these cases, and that we needed to take responsibility for the issues that were within our own control. So prior to the publication of the Ministry's Residential Service Blueprint and the Chief Coroner's Safe with Intervention report, our sector recognized the need to do work together in a very different way. Particularly focused on this webinar, in the investigations of protection issues and quality of care issues, we identified a number of critical issues that you're going to hear about, as well as recommendations for solutions. I just want to remind you that all of the recommendations related to each of these webinars and the decisions that we are asking you to implement were approved by the Executive Leadership section of our sector in June of 2018, were unanimously endorsed by the Directors of Service, and we are now seeking all of your support in implementation. We understand there are many competing pressures and priorities, even again this year, but we do want to remind everyone of the critical importance of doing our part to ensure that these kinds of tragedies do not happen in the future. So just a couple of housekeeping items. I'll remind you that your lines are muted, and we will be taking your questions at the end of the webinar. If you could enter them into the chat box, we'll take them one at a time, and we have lots of time to deal with your questions. This webinar as well will be posted on the member site within about a couple of days or a week. You'll be able to find it there to refer back to. And at this point, I'd like to introduce our speakers this morning. First, I will introduce Michelle Bacon. She's Director of Service at the London Children's Aid Society. Michelle was the chairperson of the original group who developed recommendations related to this area and provided a lot of leadership to the recommendations. And Kelly Bernier from the Children's Aid Society of Waterloo will also present this morning, as she has provided leadership to the implementation of these recommendations. And now I'd like to turn it over to them.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Corey, for that wonderful introduction and background information. So we're going to get started, and you may be asking the question, why is there a need for a common approach? Community caregiver investigations are very complex, and they require a purposeful, collaborative, and child-centered approach. There is wide variation in the method and quality of how quality of care issues and community caregiver investigations involving outside paid resources are conducted, and how follow-up occurs with the residential setting. So what happens? This results in great variability of practice across the province and creates confusion for children and youth involved, the OPRs themselves, and even the ministry. Our system is further compromised by poor communication among CASs through the failure to share quality of care concerns and investigation outcomes. So ultimately, the lack of a common framework results in compromised care and risk for children and youth residing in OPRs. You'll note that our guiding principles are transparency and collaboration. You'll see this theme throughout this framework, as well as the other recommendations from the Critical Issues Working Group. So the purpose of our webinar today, our intent is to provide a provincial framework which reflects the minimum specifications and best practices for investigating concerns involving OPRs, in addition to a guide for addressing quality of care issues. We do note that, and the working group recognized, that local context and circumstances are going to impact protocol, but we definitely want to strive for a consistent approach to how we address these issues and conduct investigations. Of course, the Ontario Child Protection Standards govern investigations of allegations of maltreatment of a child or youth in care by a community caregiver, and they provide the foundation for this framework. The core principles which guide the development of enhanced best practices, again, include transparency and information sharing, open communication, collaborative practice. This is all with the child and youth at the center of planning and decision making. So this webinar will highlight those areas of the Common Approach Framework which differ from or expand upon the Child Protection Standards. So late last week, an email was sent, and this information was posted to the member section of the OACIS website, which Corey just referenced. So I would just like to go over the documents that are included and support today's webinar. So the final paper, which is a complete detailed outline of our common approach to addressing quality of care issues and completing community caregiver investigations. There are two appendices with this final report. The first appendix is residential services community caregiver referral questions. So this is to assist screeners and those that are receiving referral information regarding an OPR, and it just outlines the basic information that's to be provided. It provides additional questions and areas of inquiry, including what are we worried about and what is working well. So that will be of assistance to screeners. Appendix number 2 is a tool for staff to assist in assessing quality of care issues. So the intent of this tool is to provide a framework for staff regarding their ongoing assessment of the quality of care of a residential setting, and that's through purposeful engagement with the child or the youth. There are 6 identified quality of care domains in this appendix, and they should be considered during every private visit with a child or a youth in an OPR family and group care setting. These quality of care domains include covering topics of voice, rights, and communication, ongoing support, the child or youth's individual path and fulfillment, belonging relationships and accepting environments, identity and culturally relevant care, service providers, and caregivers. And what this tool contains is a list of look-fors, which will assist and guide staff in assessing quality of care within that residential setting. The package also includes some key messages, questions and answers document, and of course this PowerPoint presentation. So quality of care issues. A fulsome and thorough process for gathering information at the point of referral must be completed. Information regarding the community caregiver is obviously collected from the referral source, but the worker should also be looking at collecting other available information from staff at their agency or the setting who have knowledge of the community caregiver, for example, resource staff, OPR liaisons, placement or receiving teams. It is important that CASs are able to distinguish between referrals about licensed residential settings that raise child protection concerns and may warrant a child protection investigation, and those which may relate to quality of care or potential licensing concerns, which also may require follow-up. So this slide contains an example, several examples of quality of care issues. Workers who screen referrals should be familiar with the CYFSA and ministry licensing requirements. If these concerns come to the attention of the CAS, it's important to share that information with the relevant CAS department and staff. And again, depending on your structure, your placement resource team or OPR liaison who has responsibility for overseeing the residents. And it's really important that this information is shared in a really timely manner. It is recognized that quality of care issues exist on a continuum, and from a youth and an OPR perspective, our response to such concerns should be consistent. So a discrete and separate process for addressing quality of care concerns that does not meet eligibility is not required. Rather, it should be looked at that the investigation process carries additional accountabilities and requirements. So one of the most significant changes to our practice as recommended through our working group is the establishment of an initial case conference. When conducting specialized types of community caregiver investigations or reviewing reported quality of care issues, it is absolutely imperative that information regarding the reported concerns be immediately shared with staff connected to all of the children and youth living in that residence, regardless of the home agency. It's really important that roles and responsibilities of all agencies and staff involved are also clear with respect to what the response is going to be. In order to achieve this, again, we need a collaborative approach with open information sharing. This absolutely must be adopted as our practice. So to this end, upon receiving protection concerns or quality of care issues regarding the care of a child or youth in a residential setting, a mandatory initial case conference will be scheduled within 24 hours. And that will include appropriate representation from each agency who has a child or youth placed in that residence. It is important that each stakeholder involved commit to making themselves available to participate, whether that be in person, teleconference, or a video conference. When we look at who should be attending the initial case conference, the following is a guide. Really look to the referral information, as this will assist you in determining who should be present. To guide this decision, it's important to have a solid understanding of what the presenting issues are. And the way we looked at this was, depending on the nature of the concern along the spectrum of quality of care issues to concrete safety or protection concerns, the circle of those that would participate and respond will widen. So for example, if the issue relates to recreational activities, rules in the residential setting, food preferences, or peer-to-peer conflict, that would typically involve the children's services worker, FNIM representation, the youth, and the OPR worker. Then we expand that circle to issues related to the youth. That could include staff conflict, the cleanliness of the physical environment, any inconsistency with staff. That would involve the children's services worker, again, FNIM representation, potentially your resource or your placement services, OPR worker, and supervisor. And then finally, if you're looking at issues related to systemic quality of care, especially involving more than one youth in that residential setting, a method of treatment or services rendered, staffing concerns, or safety issues, your circle is going to be quite wide and again include a children's services worker, FNIM representation, resources placement services, youth or OPR worker supervisor, notification to all placing agencies, and potentially ministry notification. So continuing to look at the initial case conference and who should attend, information that codes above the line for a community caregiver investigation would involve protection services, including the investigation phase and ongoing. Again, the children's services worker, FNIM representation must always be considered, resources and placement services, the youth or the OPR worker, likely a supervisor, again, notification to all placing agencies, and notification to ministry. As part of the investigation process, all parent agencies will be asked by the investigating CAS for information concerning their children and youth and will be invited to attend that initial case conference. FNIM consultation must occur and a plan for engagement throughout the investigation be developed. Again, we do recognize that various agency structures and roles will impact who participates in this initial case conference. So once you determine who's going to be present at the conference and those invitations have been sent, you can begin to develop your agenda on what topics are going to be discussed and what decision points need to be made. Again, the primary purpose of the initial case conference is to ensure the timely sharing of relevant information among all parties. The richness of everyone contributing information will really ensure a fulsome understanding of the important factors to be considered when planning a response or developing an investigation plan. Again, collaboration and transparent decision-making is key. So on the slide, you'll see a list of topics to be discussed and decisions that are to be made. So again, you want to have a complete and thorough review of all of the information that was reported. You want to be able to identify if there are other potential child or youth victims that need to be involved in the investigation process. You may consider consultation with your local police service. You want to develop a concrete plan for the identified victim or victims, and of course consideration should be given to them having a worker present or another support person present. You'll need to make decisions on whether the child or youth and other children and youth affected will be removed from the residence pending further investigation and assessment. How and when the alleged offender, witnesses, and other staff members will be notified and interviewed. How and when parents or kin of the affected children and youth will be notified and or potentially participate in the investigation process. Again, this is going to be unique to each situation and may be deemed appropriate or may not. Identify any other information that needs to be obtained and reviewed, and always ensure the child and youth voice and wishes is considered when determining the response or the investigation plan. So further, with respect to what will be discussed, a plan to notify or confirm notification to the Advocate's Office, assignment and documentation of tasks and responsibilities. This is really critical to ensure role clarity. Communication of the plan to all participants, again, where deemed reasonable and appropriate at this point, is important, and the rationale for decisions made should also be provided. If a participant is unable to attend the meeting, meeting notes need to be written and also distributed. So at this point, I would just like to make reference to our shared services program as it intersects with the initial case conference. The shared services program will reflect non-identifying information from community caregiver investigations in what's called a common assessment format or tool. So this information can be used to seek further details, including investigation outcomes that were previously done and documented quality of care issues through CPIN or legacy systems for those agencies that are still not on CPIN. Connection to this project to obtain additional information regarding the OPR may include the annual assessment tool or review. And again, you want to get as much information as possible during this initial case conference regarding the OPR and quality of care issues or investigations that may have happened in the past to fully inform your decision making and your next steps. And then, as I mentioned, the outcome of the initial case conference must be documented and distributed to all parties, especially paying attention to those that were unable to participate but are impacted by what your next steps are. Every referral should have some sort of response. So again, whether it's from the spectrum of, along the spectrum of no formal action being required to a quality of care issue that codes below the line, right up to a full-blown community caregiver investigation, we want to make sure that information consistently is always documented and that there is some form of response plan put into place. We know when we're documenting the opening of a case that there are CPIN naming convention practices in place as per harmonized business practices that have been adopted. So we do want to make sure that those are followed so that when we're all looking for information, we're able to find what we're looking for. Please note that all children being cared for in the home need to be listed on the file. And where there is a child welfare case on the family that remains open, the community caregiver cases are cross-referenced and linked. And given the numerous legacy systems that exist, of course, across the province, it's really imperative that detailed record checks be completed to capture the historical record. So searching for the OPR administrator name, the community caregiver name, the child youth name, and the address of the residence is all very important. When it comes to documenting the information that codes below the line, it does not meet the threshold for investigation, but again, the reported information must be documented in a referral that is appropriately coded below the line. We are really, really concerned that in the past, such information has been kept in the child and care file, and again, not easily accessible by other parties that may need to have that information. So it's really, really critical that it's easily accessible and again, shared and not solely be embedded in the child or youth file. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, who's going to speak about the planning and conducting of an investigation.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to walk us through the remaining few slides, and I'll continue to highlight, like Michelle did, the recommendations which differ from or expand upon the existing standards. So beginning with planning and conducting child protection investigation, the standards already direct that community caregiver investigations should be conducted by protection workers who have specialized knowledge and skills related to these investigations. The standards also recommend that specialized staff, including supervisors, be identified within each agency and that they be provided with appropriate training and support to ensure that they have a solid understanding of the policies and procedures of the OPR assessments and reports used by OPRs. The working group has gone a little bit farther, though, and has recommended that the threshold for specialized training is the OACAS forensic interviewing model. And we recommend that children's service workers also have this knowledge and skill to enable them to conduct exploratory interviews with children and youth and feel confident to close down a referral or to obtain the correct information to inform a follow-up consult. And in order to mitigate bias, the recommendation is that the child protection worker or children's service worker directly involved with the alleged offender not have responsibilities for the interviews, nor should the child protection worker or the child and care worker who carries the family file. And this is learning that we all remember from the Baldwin inquest. In terms of conducting a safety assessment and developing a safety plan, this we thought was very important that this be a collaborative process involving the protection staff from the home and local agencies, and this information should be communicated to other agencies who have children placed in the residential program. The local agency conducting the investigation is the one responsible to develop the safety plan. However, if the home agency decides to remove the child, that's their responsibility if they were looking for an alternate placement. If there's disagreement, though, this should be communicated by the home agency in writing. The safety assessment should encompass planning related to the alleged victim, other children and youth in the residential setting, other children and youth who may be at risk, as well as the alleged maltreater and the operator. And as we all know, it's essential to obtain the voice of the child and youth when discussing safety, and they must be included in the development of the safety plan. All communication with OPRs must flow from our protection mandate and not exceed that scope. So, it's within our mandate to identify bottom lines around safety for OPR operators, how they implement a plan to address those concerns rests with the OPR operator. We can then, once they've made a decision, we can let them know whether that meets our requirements. Making of verification decisions. This is new, that we're recommending that these decisions be made at a conference format with key individuals contributing. For institutional investigations, this has been the standard all along. The verification of the alleged protection concerns and the investigation disposition decisions need to be made. However, a determination about whether a child is in need of protection doesn't need to be made. Like Michelle spoke about in the initial conference, who attends this conference will depend upon the particular investigation, but the intent is that this is a fulsome discussion and a thorough and objective review of the evidence. So it'll be critical who we have at the table for those discussions. Documenting investigations, sorry, that looks like it skipped one. Documenting investigations. The standards already detail the documentation requirements for investigations, and in addition to those listed in the standards, the documentation should reflect a critical analysis of the information received through the investigation, the process for making the verification decision, including the rationale. In terms of documenting quality of care issues, it's as important to document the referral information regarding quality of care issues, as well as the OPR's response plan and the outcome of action taken to address the reported concerns. So, the outcome case conference, like the initial case conference, is new and is a recommendation of this working group. In keeping with the principles of transparency and collaboration, with the focus being on the best interests of the child and youth, a mandatory outcome case conference will occur at the conclusion of a child protection investigation or process to address quality of care issues. The participants at this outcome meeting should be the same as those present for the initial case conference. However, through the process, you may identify that there's other people who would have some value to add, and they can be invited. Michelle spoke about planning your initial case conference, and the same would apply in an outcome case conference. And some of the topics you would want to look at would include a review of what action has occurred since the initial case conference, a review of the investigation outcome, including verification and CAR decisions, required follow-up related to serious occurrences, reporting to the Ombudsman and the Ministry, the notification process, determination of supports for children and youth regarding the impact of any maltreatment, identification of ongoing action required and expectations of the OPR, and all specific tasks and responsibilities that are identified must be assigned and documented with required timeframes to ensure role clarification and accountability. And the plan must be communicated to all participants where reasonable and appropriate. Information regarding the rationale should also be provided. So we recognize when we say appropriate, there are going to be situations that are outside your typical investigation, and agencies need to be able to reflect on the current situation and make the right decision in the right case. So the common approach expands the list of stakeholders requiring notification at the outcome of an investigation. And we're recommending that the following individuals be notified: the child and youth who's the subject of the concerns, other impacted children and youth, agency staff, local and home who work directly with the child, youth, and family, FNMI representation, the caregiver of the child where that's appropriate, the person alleged to have caused the child protection concerns, the administrator of the institutional setting, and the worker responsible for oversight of the community caregiver, as well as the ministry. Notification to the person alleged to have caused a need for protection and the administrator of the setting is provided in a face-to-face meeting, which is different than the standards, and followed up in writing. And the letter provides non-identifying information, including the details of the allegation and the verification decision and rationale. Written notification is required to the alleged victim, family, the worker, and agency responsible for overseeing the home, and the ministry, and it will contain details of the allegation, the verification decision and rationale, the details of the safety plan, and any recommendations regarding additional supports or corrective action. For the CAS responsible for the alleged victim, we're required to provide detailed disclosure of rationale for the verification decision. And for all other CASs with children and youth in the OPR, simply advising them that the investigation is concluded and whether the protection concerns were verified is what's expected. So that wraps up almost wraps up. Sorry, I have a couple more here. Quality of care. So there's not the need to create a different tool to complete quality of care process reviews. You should use the previous guidelines that we just talked about to develop a notification plan following a quality of care inquiry. The outcome of the response plan, including interviews, observations, and follow-through on any stated expectations, need to be documented and shared with all parties. And where a residential setting has numerous unverified child protection investigations, the responsible CAS, or the local CAS, should conduct an internal conference to review the history and consider next steps to address repeatedly identified issues and concerns and mitigate risk of future harm. And we talked a lot about working transparently. It's really important that we're engaging with the OPRs when we receive issues, but they're not investigated, so that they're aware of the concerns that are coming forward. And Michelle referred to a number of the tools that have been included, and in this situation, if you want to refer to Appendices 2, the tool to assess quality of care issues, I think you'd find that very, very helpful. So that's the end of the formal presentation.
Thank you very much, Michelle and Kelly. Really appreciate you taking us through all these changes. I am aware as I'm listening that it sounds like a lot and is kind of overwhelming in the hearing, so I'm just conscious of that for our listeners. But of course, some of these expectations are requirements already. What we're really hoping to drive home this morning are two things. One, in summary, I should say. One, that we are wanting to ensure that the same rigorous processes and thought is applied to quality of care investigations, and this is because this was really identified as a critical gap in many of these tragic circumstances. And secondly, that there is much greater transparency across our sector and between our sector and the ministry and the OPR operators. So those two main themes came through quite clearly. I just want to remind everyone that these are all decisions that have been approved and do represent the current expectations of the sector going forward. I noticed as well a mention to the Office of the Child Advocate. That's clearly an error that I should have caught, and that will be deleted prior to the posting. In terms of the increased transparency and collaboration with the ministry and the OPR sector, a couple of comments. First of all, the working group heard from a number of children's aid societies that already have this practice, that is, communicate with the OPR operators when they receive these concerns and are planning these investigations, and do connect with their ministry program supervisor or licensing staff in the process as well, and that these discussions, these involvements, this increased transparency has worked very well for those agencies. So I wanted people to be aware of that. Finally, I just want to let everyone know or remind you that the OACS and the ANAPCO have been involved in ongoing conversations with MCCSS for the last couple of years about these recommendations, about these decisions, and about the need to formalize our commitment to increased collaboration for these investigations and review processes. I'm pleased that the ministry is very much in support of this, that we actually have been looking at a draft written collaborative agreement or / protocol, not sure what it will be called in the end, that literally formalizes this commitment across ourselves and government to communicate formally with respect to the planning and conclusion of these investigations. I think this is really, really important, and again has been identified as a critical gap in the past. So in the absence of that agreement being finalized, what the ministry and ourselves have agreed upon is that CASs will be advised that this is a new expectation. The ministry had made a commitment to let all their regional offices and licensing staff know that this decision has been made and will be implemented at this point going forward. So hopefully your local regional office is aware. You may, of course, encounter someone who is not, but please feel free to share this information then with them. And it is my hope that in the near future, a written collaborative agreement will be finalized. So I think those are all the comments I wish to make at the end, and I just want to open it up now for your questions. And thank you for not 55 people commenting about the mistake about the advocate. I do appreciate that. Any questions from Hamilton? Can you just, yeah, thanks. Though investigations can be linked to the OPR provider record, an intake concerns that may fall below the intervention line do not link to the provider record. As such, they need to be inputted into the provider record under a quality of care document contact log. Yes, thank you, Hamilton. You're once again, as members of the pilot of this new business harmonization process, reminding us of the expectations with respect to documentation. I appreciate that. I know that there was a webinar last week, I believe, on the business harmonization processes for the provider record, and I'm sure this was mentioned there. That webinar is also available on the member site for review, and it's absolutely critical that this information be documented in the provider record. So thank you for that. We see someone typing, so we'll just wait for their comment. Is an initial case conference required for coding that falls below the intervention line? Is the verification conference completed at the outcome case conference? So thank you for raising the question. If this wasn't clear, I'm happy to have a chance to address it again, and I'm going to ask Michelle or Kelly to pick up on this question.
Hi, Corey. Thank you. It's Michelle. Yes, I would agree or believe that absolutely that initial case conference is still required. Again, it fits with our theme of open communication, information sharing, and if it falls below the line, there likely is still some follow-up that has to occur with the worker, the child or youth placed in the residential setting, and most likely the residential setting staff themselves. So I would absolutely agree that an initial case conference still should be pulled together to review the reporting information and any other information that may be known about that provider. And yes, the verification conference can be completed at the outcome case conference.
Thank you, Michelle. What we have noted in the process of developing the recommendations is in the past, these were the circumstances that often, or at least sometimes, were not discussed with all CASs who had children placed in a certain residential service provider. And so that is the purpose of the increased rigor, is that any CAS who receives information like this that codes below the line involves any other agency with children in that home, so that that information as a sector is pooled, is understood more holistically, and that will lead to better analysis, better decisions, better protection, better quality of care for children. And from York CAS, when you mentioned that the initial case conference needs to be documented, is there some thought about how that should be documented? Michelle or Kelly, can you address that question?
So I can advise that we didn't develop a specific tool or outline, a template, if you will, for documenting the initial case conference. But really, I think it's just capturing who was present, what the issues are, and more importantly, what the identified next steps are, who's responsible for those next steps, and what the required timeframes are. So I think it's really more of just a minute keeping task, if you will, a summary of what happened at that initial case conference. I think if we wanted to consider developing a common template or tool for that initial case conference, that's something that we could do.
Yeah, thank you. I will pass that on to the analyst here who is picking up on the any further implementation activities.
Mm-hmm.
Given that it's been indicated that the initial conference should take place within 24 hours, how is that process impacted by a weekend or holiday? Michelle or Kelly, do you have a thought about a response for that?
I think that's an excellent question. I mean, ideally, we're striving to get parties together sooner rather than later, which is why we came up with a defined time frame of 24 hours. Clearly, on a weekend or extended holiday period, that would present challenges, and the information would need to be responded to in a plan developed even on the weekend or the holidays. So I think my suggestion would be that you're doing the best that you can to inform all relevant parties and bring together those that you can that should be present to hear the information and be a part of the development of a response plan and those identified next steps. And then, of course, when it comes to your typical next business day, ensuring that that plan is disseminated to everybody that needs to hear the information and be aware that wasn't available to participate in the conference, again, if it was the weekend or a holiday.
Thanks, Michelle. Any other questions? Okay, if not, then it gives me extreme pleasure to let you know that this is the last of the residential service webinars, and that we are confident that implementation of these decisions will result in an increase in the quality of care that children and youth receive. And we thank you, every single one of you, for your role in that implementation. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful day and a restful summer.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you for all of your support.
You're welcome.